My name is Nirva LaFortune, or Councilwoman Nirva LaFortune. So my connection with Providence is that Providence is my hometown. Although I wasn't born in the city, out of all my siblings, I'm the oldest of five. I'm the only one who was born out of the country. I'm an immigrant. And I was actually undocumented until I was about 14 years old. When I left Haiti, my family escaped a dictatorship, the fall of a dictatorship, and due to poor immigration policies, we were separated. I later joined my family when I was about 3, and I came right to Providence. And we lived on the West End, then Lower South Side, and then Washington Park, where my parents have lived for over 31 years. So my connection to Providence is deeply rooted. I went through the schools, I played at the rec centers, swam in the pools, volunteered in the community. It's my home. It's part of my roots. It's part of who I am. And I'm truly connected with the city. And it's interesting that, I came back after living away, and I chose to raise my children here, but also serve in the capacity of a city council person and representing a ward where my mom actually worked in someone's home. So it's part of who I am, Providence. So that's my connection.
It's good to know that we got variety in the candidates that we get in Providence. Not all are like just people that are born here.
Mm-hmm.
That we get people that are like from outside that want to be important figures in this country. We got like variety, and we are united as a community in Providence.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, considering the climate that we lived through when we had a former president who didn't see the importance of immigrants, and who actually gave people the license to be racist and be bigots and sexist, and also, put immigrant children in cages. That was traumatizing for me as someone who was separated from my family. And to think that we still have these poor policies, it's important for us also to have representatives and people who are elected, who are leaders in our city, who understand the lives of so many people. And being an immigrant, you can be an immigrant from Latin America, like I am. You can be an immigrant from South America, from Africa, from Europe. But it also shows that immigrants play such a significant role in our community, and they too can be leaders and represent the beautiful diversity of the city of Providence. You mentioned a city where you feel safe, and also, where a police officer, won't harass you because of your immigration status or the color of your skin. I still reflect on watching George Floyd, right? We all, the whole world, watched someone in a position of power who was to enforce the law, did it in such a cruel, oh my goodness, way by literally putting his knee on someone's neck and slowly taking another man's life, a Black man's life. It's a reminder of why people have to stand up and say Black lives matter, because we also live in a society and a nation, in a world where when you are the others, not part of this homogeneous status, you are not white, then you are not as valued as other people. When I see young people advocating, when I see people who look like me running for office, when I see people who come from different countries and come to America working hard, but also standing up for their rights, and saying that our lives matter, we need to continue to elevate those things and elevate the stories of others, because, we do live, Providence is wonderful, but there's still deep inherited racism that exists within our city, within our state, within our nation, and it's up to all of us to do the work. I'm very different. It's interesting when you're watching the news and you read these articles and they're like, oh, the candidates haven't distinguished themselves. But what I realize is that when you're a candidate that is very different than the status quo, sometimes people there are things that are right in front of them they don't want to see. I'm very different than the other candidates. I'm a working mom. I'm a woman. Right? We never want to talk about identity politics, but identity politics plays a role in politics every single day. Because at the end of the day, when I walk into a room, the first thing that people see is my gender and my skin color. And they start judging me accordingly. And you see it through the questions that they ask you. I've knocked on doors and people say, oh, you're wonderful. tell me a bit about yourself. Where did you get your education? And when I say that I went to Temple and that I have a graduate degree from Brown, they're like, oh, it's like they're shocked. Or when people say things like, you're articulate, as if, you know, you're not expected to speak well or be intelligent. They don't do that to my male opponents and my white opponents. And I also have to prove that I've done X, Y, and Z, which I've been working so hard. And we live in a society where there are many people, particularly those of marginalized identities. There's real gender gaps. There's real racial gaps where you see people doing the work and doing it 5 times and working 5, 6 times harder. And yet they're not getting paid the same as, others, or they're not getting the recognitions that they need. And what differentiates me from the other candidates is that I've been doing the work. And my focus has been on the issues that matter to real people in the city of Providence. The government should work for every single person, not just for the people that they know. My family left a country where there was a government that was corrupt. My grandfather was killed, was murdered in the 1990s during the coup d'etat after Aristide was ousted out of Haiti because he stood up, for himself. And so government has to work for people, and people have to feel safe and trust the government that is leading the cities, the places that they live. So I do the work that I do, and I prioritize those issues: education, public safety, affordability, a government that works for all people, and making investments in our neighborhoods, because I've seen families who that didn't work for them, and I too have experienced that. For many years, I was ashamed of my story. I didn't want to talk to people about being undocumented. I didn't want to talk about losing my partner. I didn't really want to talk about being homeless when I was pregnant with my son. But I've realized that when I talk about my story, it also encourages and motivates others to want to do something about it, because my story is not unique. And it also allows people to see that there are others who are like them, and we can come together to fight for these things. And so it's also important for us to have leaders who understand these stories, because they're not coming from a place where, oh, I'm here to save you. I'm going to be the great knight, who's going to come to save you from all your worries. But they know how to effectively work with our communities in a restorative, but also an equitable way, to come up with solutions to address these problems. And not solutions where we put bandages, but sustainable, real, impactful solutions. But in order to do that, you have to talk to the people. You have to understand these stories. And for a long time, like I always use the policy, because we're, in an educational institution, no child left behind, right? That was an educational policy that under Bush. And, the people who created this policy were some of the people who are part of the 1%ers, some of the richest people in the United States. They created a policy that was supposed to be implemented in every city, every district, whether you were in a rural area, whether you were in an urban or suburban. But you may have all these requirements and these tools, but you don't give these requirements or these initiatives, but you don't give people the tools to reach that bar. So what ended up happening is that you had districts that were cheating, right? Or they were forging these numbers so that they can show that they were doing better, so teachers wouldn't lose their jobs, administrators wouldn't lose their jobs, instead of the government and the districts really working with them to say, this is what the goals are, but these are the tools, because we know not everyone is equal, right? You live in a suburb, you might have more additional resources, or your students might look different because your students' English might be their primary language, where in another district, that's not. or students who are coming to school, they didn't eat breakfast, or they don't have access to lunch. So you can't learn when you're hungry. So it's like these basic things that we don't always think about. And it comes down to access. So that's why it's important for us to have leaders that have both the professional and lived experience, because they also understand that initiatives don't always look the same. For initiatives are not received the same way as for everyone. And we need to ensure that whatever that goal is, whatever that initiative is, we need to provide people with the tools and communities with the tools and resources to reach that bar and to access it.
Let me ask you this question. How do you feel about the picture on the Providence Journal that's causing controversy?
Well, the only controversy it should be causing is for people to hold the Providence Journal accountable for doing such a blatantly racist and sexist thing, to be frank. It was, I'm a subscriber to the Providence Journal because I do believe in journalism as someone who graduated from a school of communications. It's, I support print journalism. And imagine going outside, picking up the paper and seeing on the front cover a photo that perpetuates negative stereotypes of women, particularly Black women. That was really disrespectful. It was the editors that made this decision. It wasn't the journalist, because she brought, a photographer, and they have other photos of me. They've taken other photos. But for them to choose it also showed me that it showed me the inequity in this race as well. You have two men, and let's be frank, these are two men who are white appearing, right? And you have this one woman, this one Black woman. And you know what? In the whole history of the state of Rhode Island, we have never elected a Black woman to be a mayor in any city. We have never elected a Black woman to serve in any state, like executive level state position. It was horrible. I think it was intentional. But this is what I love about right here. I am being interviewed by a young person of color. I am being filmed by a young woman, or, what pronouns do you prefer? She, her. And what pronouns do you prefer? Okay, just making sure. Of color, a brown young man, or a Black woman. And, we have a very diverse group of people, a teacher, yes. We're in a room where it's so diverse. And this is what we need in media. And, I asked all of you when I first walked in, oh, you're juniors. What are you thinking of, for the future? I do hope that you pursue journalism, mass media, and film, because we do need to see you all doing the interviews. We need to see you all filming us. We need to see you all, taking the notes and being in the backgrounds, because you understand the importance of delivering a story in an authentic way, but also not perpetuating the negative stereotypes of people who look like us. A leader has the power to affect change if they are willing to be bold and not be afraid to do things that are a bit different in order to affect that change. And I think a lot of times when people get into these positions of power, then they get really scared, or they feel that, they can't do certain things because they're beholden to someone who donated, or these powerful entities. And I'm going in because my priority is the city of Providence, to be a leader that brings people to the table, that listens, that understands the importance of access, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and not just by words, but through actions. And so that's why, for me, prioritizing those key things: education, public safety, affordable city, an accessible city, a government that works for the people and make the investments in our neighborhoods, in our infrastructure. That's why, and in our environment, that's why those are important to me, because I've seen so many people in the city of Providence who sometimes government forgot about them, but the system tore them down. and I want the system to work for everyone, regardless of what neighborhood they live in. So I take this role quite seriously, and I don't want to let my community down. I don't want to let my children down, my parents down, the people that I see every day, you all down.
If you have the opportunity to make a change in the school system, what would you do?
So I do want to transition our schools back to local control. I launched an educational plan. So one, I want us to produce more teachers of color, which is part of our turnaround plan to have a more diverse teaching force. And through that, I want to start a teacher residency program, a citywide teacher residency program. Mount Pleasant High School, the high school that I went to, had a teacher academy. And this is an opportunity for us to develop teachers from the city of Providence who grew up here, and to become educators, to serve students from their communities, and they could relate to them. They look like them. They reflect their diverse identities. But also, I want to make sure that our kids have access and our teachers have access to tools and resources so that they can thrive. That includes having social emotional support and services, counselors in our schools, wraparound services in our schools. That means having also buildings, 21st century buildings where kids can be successful in, and there's not mold on the walls and the roof is not leaking. That also means quality before and after school programs. Every school should have access to the arts, whether it's theater or chorus or music, but we should all have writing. We should all have access to the arts. And working with our colleges like RISD and Brown and PC to bring in additional resources. And also, there's been this tension between our public schools, between the charter and their traditional public. And as mayor, I want to break that tension and bring everyone together and learn from each other. This is an opportunity for us to partner with our charters that are successful. Like TAPA is a great school, and it provides kids with all these opportunities and introduce them to the arts. But how can we also work with our traditional public schools? How can we have training for teachers in all our public schools, whether you're in charter or traditional public, and learn best practices and opportunities for our kids to work together through programs like Providence Student Union and Young Voices, Arise, amongst others. So what I want to do is address the disparities, bring our schools back to local control, set the foundation to meet the goals outlined in the turnaround plan, and truly make the investments to transform our schools.
I know that we spoke about the flood that happened and everything. What are your plans to prevent buildings and all the infrastructure like that to be that fragile and to have people homeless that live like that? It could be extremely dangerous for those people. What is your plan to fixing that problem?
Actually, I have a 100-day plan within my platform. And within the first 100 days, I want to, so there's this climate justice action plan that was put together by community advocate groups, advocates, environmental practitioners, and scholars. And what I want to do is, within my first 100 days, is bring people to the table and see where we are in meeting those climate justice goals. I also co-sponsored as a city councilwoman to create the first sustainability office within the city of Providence. We've never had that before. And what I want to do is work with the Sustainability Office and Department of Public Works to make some investments. And we did allocate some funds through the American Rescue Plan Act. I'm the person who led the effort to pass legislation and to create the task force. But we allocated some funding to start making those infrastructure improvement, the stormwater and wastewater infrastructure improvement that could help prevent the floods. But we also need to make some real environmental mitigations. And we have this climate action plan. I want to see where we're at and see what the needs are to meet all the goals. And I want to set a goal by the end of my 4 years, and by the end of my next 4 years, so 8 years in total, to meet as many of those goals as possible. In terms of housing, we need to build more housing. I've been talking about that for quite some time. It's like economics. The demand is high, the supply is low, it drives up the prices of housing. 2 years ago, I actually introduced an ordinance that would require any developer who's getting any tax incentive, which is, we call it a tax stabilization agreement, where they pay like the base tax for the property before it's developed, and then it ramps up over years. And it could be like for 15 years, it could be for 20 years. But with anyone who's getting that, they have to build affordable housing units. So we need to build more affordable housing. There are models throughout the city. We have the West Elmwood housing model, where some people are subsidized, some people are paying market rate. But we also have to invest in programs that build housing for people to purchase their own home, because that's a way to narrow the wealth gap and the equity gap. People need to have a chance to buy their own homes in various neighborhoods throughout the city. And part of my plan to build affordable housing in every single neighborhood is, historically, we have areas where there's concentrated poverty. So it's like we push all poor people in one particular part of the city or one particular neighborhood. And we should be building diverse communities, socioeconomically diverse communities. And that's why this ordinance would help do that. And so I want to build more housing. I want to work with the state to maximize the funds that we receive from the federal government so that we build more housing in the city of Providence, but also looking at zoning policies that have prevented us from building housing on certain parcels of land. And, this is also a way to get a grasp on the rising rent prices throughout the city of Providence. And we also need to support landlords who have been struggling as well. Utilities are going up. The cost of living is going up. Taxes have gone up. So there's a balance, right? But I want to build more housing, build more affordable housing units across the board for low to moderate income, for people who are aging, for people who are unhoused and transitioning to permanent housing. And they have wraparound services there, but we have to build more housing. We also have to look at the zoning policies so that we can build housing on smaller lots so people can also purchase their first homes.
With everything they show in the media, the way people are living, the way people of color are being treated, you cannot call this the American dream at the moment. You cannot, it's just not available. People being poor, suffering, illness, drug abuse. It's a sad thing to see in our city. We want the best for everyone. That's what we all want. Sometimes we cannot have that, but we need to work for that.
I see it. It's right in front of you. And also around City Hall, that area has one of the highest opioid overdose rates in the country. And when you're homeless, it also leads to other types of challenges that one is navigating. It's compounded. And so I see it because I've also lived being homeless. Like, I've lived that experience. And for me, I luckily had a couple of friends who would let me sleep on their couch here and there. And I've talked to people. I've gone out with House of Hope. When I see people are homeless on the streets, I talk to them. And, I still remember when I shared the talk, I touched upon this earlier. When I was a kid, St. John's Episcopal Church, right on North Main Street, had a soup kitchen, and there was a gentleman, I think he was Armenian, and every week he would come to the soup kitchen, but he would always dress in a suit. And at first I didn't believe he was homeless, because I'm like, he has a suit, and he always had like a briefcase. And I started talking to him, and I said, you always wear a suit, but yet you come to the soup kitchen. And he said, well, I'm homeless. And I said, but why do you wear a suit? He said, because when I wear a suit, people will at least show me respect. And what he said was, there are people who are homeless and people don't see them because they're not they're not well dressed, they're in rags, and people can walk down the street and they don't see those folks. And he said, I wanted to be acknowledged. I wanted to feel like a human. And I think a lot of times people just don't see people who don't look like them. And they see people on the streets and they make all these judgment calls, but not know how they got there. So that gentleman became homeless because he got sick. He lost his job. He was having some family problems. His wife and his children, they left. And he found himself living in his car. Then his car got towed, and then he was living in homeless shelters. He had the one suit. That was the suit he wore every single day, so he can have a bit of dignity. And we don't know what caused people to be homeless, but it's our responsibility as a community to figure out how we can help people to get them on the pathway to permanent housing. And a lot of times people are homeless, like I said earlier, it's compounded. People are experiencing substance use. People are experiencing mental health. And so when we're creating housing to allow people to transition to permanent housing from being unhoused, we also need to make sure there are services that is provided to them so that their needs could be met, so they don't go back to being homeless because one service wasn't provided and the systems weren't talking to each other. No one should feel invisible. And that's important because when you see people, that's when you will prioritize them. But a lot of times we don't see them, and they're right in front of us. People are right in front of us. They're struggling. And yet we have these blinders and we're unable to see them and understand how they got there. There are rich people who take drugs, right? There are rich people and people of privilege who've faced adversity. But the difference might be is because they might have a good lawyer. They could afford it. They might have a supporting family that can help them as they get on the pathway to recovery. But when you don't have any of that.
Something that I guess can be fixed about our community, not just in Providence, but I guess they're working on it, is like the gun violence. So, because I heard you spoke about you lost your
Partner, yeah, my partner. He had proposed to me. Yeah.
You lost him because of a missed bullet?
Yeah, stray bullet that hit him.
It's just, you don't want to see somebody that you love losing their life because of something, a dispute of other people. He was not involved, and he still suffered the consequences. You don't want to see neither the outcome or the possibility of the outcome. You don't
have to
wanna
make
see them
investments.
both. You just want to feel safe and secure. You don't want to see the opportunity for it to happen.
Yeah.
What do you think about changing the people that have at least hardening the laws of like gun violence, like the possibility of getting the equipment to do that?
To make investments in our neighborhoods and also invest in our education to ensure that our young people have access to quality education and opportunities. You know, I always think about the person who pulled the trigger that took his life. I always wonder, why was that the choice that he made? Because he got into a fight with someone and he decided, without any regard for other people's lives, and his only method to resolving a conflict was taking out a gun and taking someone else's life. You know, he took my best friend. My best friend.
The person that you love, right?
Yeah, and who loved me unconditionally. You know, it's also like the young man, William Parson, who was shot and killed in front of PCTA a few years ago. I think about the other young kid who pulled the trigger. And, you know, this was a kid. We lost 2 young people that day. You know, I think about, what is it that we didn't do? The schools let him fall through the cracks. What could we have done to ensure that this kid wasn't feeling like he needed to have a gun to protect himself or to resolve a conflict, or think he spotted someone and the only solution was to use a gun? So part of it is, you know, because we've worked and I've advocated to pass stronger sense laws at the state level, but the guns off the streets, those are being sold illegally. And what we have to also do is to ensure that our young people can make better choices. And to make better choices, you have to have mentors, you have to have people you have to have opportunities, you have to have programs, you have to understand the impact of making certain choices. And so that's why investments in our neighborhoods, invest in our youth through mentorship programs, through an apprenticeship program, which is part of my my platform, my plan, through making sure we're making environmental mitigation so our young people are not growing up with asthma, to mental and behavioral health resources in our schools so we can normalize speaking to a counselor, right? Speaking to a therapist, in many communities of color, in immigrant communities, that's stigmatized. But then you can actually talk about the trauma, and you can learn to also address some of the issues that you're feeling about yourself. And you can learn to love yourself so you can learn to love others. And we also need to create a community of love and intentionally do things to bring our communities together so that we can understand each other's differences, but see the differences as ways to address some of the challenges that our communities face, and show love and kindness to each other. I will admit that after he died, it took me a long time to process it and to accept his death. I also hated, the people who, the person who pulled the trigger. And also I was upset because there were people who were there, but because of the lack of trust with the police, no one spoke up. So his death, has never been solved. So when I talk about community policing, I want people to build trust so they feel safe. If they see a crime, they could speak about it so that the families can have closure. Because the worst thing that could happen is, oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
Now it's a hard topic.
Is when you lose someone and you never have closure. You never have closure. So you have all these questions. It's been 17 years and I still cry. So, but that's part of changing the system, but also being brave enough to talk about the issues. You can't police your way out of these things. You have to build trust. You have to invest in our neighborhoods. I'm on this journey, and I think about him often now because I'm on this journey, and I know he would have been so proud of me, but he's not there to share it with me. So anyway, we have to invest in our neighborhoods, and we do have to build that trust so we have real community policing. That trust is key. We have to build that trust and making those investments in our communities, but also not criminalizing people for mental health, for behavioral health, and people who are navigating substance use. We can't criminalize them for that. We need to give them the support to get on the pathway to recovery, to get on the pathway to, talking about, the things that impact them, and also giving them tools and connecting them to resources to get them into permanent housing.
I have a question. As a female, you are very targeted, as you mentioned earlier, also a person of color. What can you say to young girls to motivate them to fight this stereotype that women are the wicked link in politics, most likely?
Yeah. The best way to fight those stereotypes is to run for office, is to pursue the things that you want to pursue, even though we live in a society that makes us believe that we cannot do it, because we can. And women, a lot of times, and girls are better at it. I'm sorry, guys. That's how you fight it. Continue to be your best self and be confident in who you are. It took me a long time to, like I said earlier, to be able to share my story, to be able to be confident in the person that I am. So last week was my daughter's first week of school, and she started 7th grade. And in 7th grade, 7th grade was a blur for me because it was a hard time for me. I wasn't really confident in who I am. And I realized is that, these stereotypes that society continue to perpetuate, it makes us believe that we're not enough, but you are. And so If you want to pursue something, if you want to run for office, if you want to play a certain sport that's been dominated by men, if you are afraid that because you're black, brown, indigenous, a girl, trans, or you're the other, as they would put us in these categories, push against all those labels and do it. You know, like Nike always says, do it. It's as simple as that, because the worst thing that could happen is, hey, you don't win, or you might, not succeed the first. You always succeed, but maybe something happens, but you learn from that experience and you could always try again if you choose. But do not let those stereotypes, those things that tell you that you're not enough, you're not good enough, stop you from pursuing what you want to pursue. Because remember, our whole world was based on this notion that, if you weren't a white male, you couldn't be in certain positions, you couldn't do certain things. And we have to normalize that all people, as long as we continue, we make sure that there are tools and resources to make it accessible, can pursue whatever they want, right? Can change the world. And so it's also our jobs to do these things and also advocate and push for those tools to ensure that women have the campaign finances, to ensure that that every woman in every state who's running, they could use campaign funds to pay for daycare, which we did pass a law here in the state of Rhode Island, thanks to some amazing women leaders at the State House. But we need to normalize it, but we also have to set policies. We have to codify those policies to ensure that they are laws and we're able to access certain tools that narrows those equity gaps. Unfortunately, you do have to have tough skin, but the more of us that does it, the more of us that's challenged the status quo, the easier it will be for others to follow and to forge their own path.
How you connect with my Hispanic communities? How you click with them as you're running for mayor?
Right. So Smiling been very helpful in helping me. I am a Black woman of Afro-Latina descent. In fact, in my growing up, there were 4 languages that spoke in my family. There was Haitian Creole, French, and Spanish. Sometimes it's a challenge because when people see me and I'm Haitian, and Haiti was the first Latin American country, Haiti. Sometimes they don't accept me as being a woman who's Latina as well. And being from Latin America is not a monolith, right? You can speak Portuguese, like Samara, who's part of my team. She's from Brazil. You can speak Spanish. You can speak French Creole. You can speak French. You can speak other indigenous language. You are of the people of Taino and Awak, in indigenous nations. What I do hope to do as mayor is to also make sure that I understand, people within the Latino community, because they make up a significant percentage of our city's population. And they play an important role, and all our immigrants play an important role in our economy. The neighborhood that I grew up in Washington Park, most of my parents' neighbors, are mostly Dominicans, right? My dad's able to communicate because he speaks a little bit Spanish. Throughout my campaign, every communication we send out, we do it in English and in Spanish. We make sure that when we're going places, we bring a translator so that people can connect to the message. But also, I want to make sure that I hear from all people, regardless of what languages they speak. And I also realize, too, there's Spanish, but there's also Southeast Asian languages. And there's Southeast Asian communities that sometimes we are not including, in these conversations, and people from different parts of the world, Africa, other places. And so for me, creating an inclusive city is to ensure that all voices are represented. And even part of my administration, I want to make sure that we have a diverse administration where we do have people who speak Spanish, where we do have people who speak French, where we do have people who speak different Southeast Asian or Asian languages. And we also have representatives that can connect to those communities as well, so that the voices of all those communities are also brought into City Hall. My whole life, I've been labeled from illegal to alien to immigrant to woman to black to this to that my whole life. And we live in a society that wants to put us in these boxes. We have to check off a box. When in reality, you don't have to fit in a box to be a leader. In fact, the best people are the ones who kind of go out of the, these perimeters, because they understand that one box doesn't fit all. And we need a leader who gets that. I'm here because I'm inspired by you all. And so I meant what I said. Do not give up the work that you're doing, because part of advocacy and ensuring that people understand what's happening is for people to be able to help people tell their stories. And what you all are doing is helping people tell the stories and why, the purpose. So I hope you continue this work as well, because it is inspiring for me. So thank you.